right, and YouTube is up and running.
You know, a mother can always be proud of her son, no matter the age.
I suppose that is allowed. All right, I think that puts everything into place. And look at that, only 1 minute past 12. That's not too bad a start time. Hopefully everyone can see on the screen that we are going to be beginning with chapter 16 from the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. I'm just going to start off with a little bit of a summary because Beshallach has a lot of stuff going on. And a lot of what's going on is important to keep in mind when we get to where we are right now in chapter 16. So Beshallach begins with the Exodus formally, that is to say, the actual leaving of Egypt proper and the coming up against of the Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf. And very famously, the Yam parts, the sea parts, and our people move through it. We get to the other side and we sing Shirat Hayam, the magnificent song of the sea, which most people remember at least the key line, Mi chamocha, who is like you among the mighty, who is like you, God. And right after we finish that incredible celebration with all the dancing and all the singing, we come into the realities of what next. And that's where we are in chapter 16. Reality is setting in. And as reality sits in, well, we get a little bit of complaints. Now we're going to do a little timelining here right at the beginning. So I'll leave the explanation of exactly when this is happening for just a minute. But does everyone understand where we are in the broad timeline of the Torah and the Exodus from Egypt? I'm not seeing any questions or comments, so let's get down to work. Chapter 16, verse 1. Setting out from Elim, the whole Israelite community came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after the departure from the land of Egypt. So that means that we are looking at about a month has passed since the first month, which was the month of Pesach. In the wilderness, oops, where's my mouse? In the wilderness, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. What is their complaint? The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, meaning if God had killed us along with the Egyptians during the plagues. When we sat by the flesh pots, when we ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to starve this whole congregation to death. All right, so very importantly, the phrase flesh pot doesn't really get used a lot in common English nowadays, but they are literally talking about sir habasar, about large pots with meat in it that think of it like a stew pot, a crock pot that they would have been eating from. So basically they are complaining that they don't have meat and they don't have bread and that they are going to starve here in the wilderness. So we have that as our basic form of what's going on, right? They are hungry and they don't have food. Now, what's wrong with this complaint? Well, this is the group of people who just a few weeks ago were singing Mi chamocha, who is like you, God, among the mighty. These are the people who did live through all of the makot, the plagues in Egypt, and saw God's power in so many ways and to such a degree that their grumbling and complaining seems just a little bit ungrateful. But not just ungrateful, but also just, well, haven't you got the word that God can take care of problems? God can cause problems and God can fix problems. God can cause problems for the Egyptians. God can part an entire sea. So what is going on here? Why are we complaining? And that is something we're going to have to dig into in more detail. But I just want to make sure that you understand the audacity of the complaint and the incomprehensibility of the complaint. Of, this would be like, your children complaining that something was on a high shelf, and who could possibly ever get it from the high shelf when they've seen you take things off high shelves all the time. It's like, how is this a problem that is worth grumbling about? It is worth complaining about. Any questions or comments before we get to the response?
A question and comment. This is the second grumbling. The first one, of course, the end of chapter 15. The people complain there's no water. They grumble there's no water. Now they're grumbling there's no food. They seem to be very focused on basic necessities. I need water. I need food. But there is that tension going back and forth of testing and desire. Where your desires can pull you into one direction, and that can test you. Your desires can lead you into an area that may not be best.
But there is also the question of, are their desires inappropriate? Right? They want water. They want food. I mean, come on, that is something you need, right? Please go on.
Right. Yes, I would say they went out with their flocks. So they're surrounded by goats and sheep and cows and everything. But I don't remember anyone saying you can't use those. So they're surrounded.
Yes.
By food.
As the prophet Samuel will say to Saul, is that the lowing of cattle that I hear? In the midst of this conversation, they have huge flocks and herds. Now, I should point out that their flocks and herds are a slowly renewing resource. This is not like if you eat your cow, you can just go get a new one tomorrow. Most animals were not turned into meat at a moment's notice. Most animals were kept alive to either produce new animals or to produce the other byproducts, whether it be wool or hair from goats or milk from both goats and cows. So yes, they definitely had plenty of livestock, but they probably were resistant to eating their livestock. The same way that a person who's unemployed, someone could say, well, why don't you just sell your car? And then you can use that money to pay for food. And then you try to explain, yes, but if they sell their car, how are they going to get a job? Because unless you live in a very densely populated urban area with good public transportation, not Orlando, then you kind of need a car to have a job. Not 100%, but almost 99% of the time, you're going to be wanting a car for employment. So yes, we can wonder about their livestock, and that will come back up in our commentary review. But we can also cut them a little slack, maybe. But that's something we're going to debate in a little bit more detail later. All right, so let's see how this is going to respond, or how this is going to be responded to. And the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread for you from the sky, and the people shall go out and gather each day that day's portion, that I may thus test them, to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. And we've had other classes where we look at the specific instructions about the man, or manna, as it's often referred to in English. So I'm not going to reiterate all of that, but for the moment, just understand that the bread portion of the people's complaint is going to be handled daily by this rain of bread. Specifically for the instructions, we also know on the sixth day, when they apportion what they have brought in, it shall prove to be double the amount they gather each day. So that they are going to get double on what we would call Friday. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, by evening you shall know it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall behold the presence of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For who are we that you should grumble against us? since it is, the Lord, Moses continued, who will give you flesh to eat in the evening and bread in the morning to the full, because the Lord has heard the grumbling you utter against him. What is our part? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. All right, so a lot of things got introduced in Moses and Aaron's transmission of the message to the people. First is this idea of the presence or glory of God, the kavod, that's going to be demonstrated through this miraculous providing of the bread, what we will call manna, as well as what will come in the evening, which is going to be basar, which is going to be meat. And that both of these are going to satiate the people. But you may also notice that we are seeing in verses 7 and 8 this idea of, who are we that you should grumble against us, right? Your complaint is not against us, your complaint against God. And that is something that I think bears much more discussion, because we saw, let me scroll back up here at our beginning, we saw that the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And they are saying, why didn't you leave us behind, right? Why did you bring us out of the land of Egypt, right? This is bad for us, right? We should have stayed in Egypt, but you brought us out, and this is now what is happening to us. And that is, I think, part of the issue here in this whole discussion. And it's easy to get distracted by the manna and easy to distracted by the meat, which will turn out to be in the form of quails. But the fact that they are attributing their exit from Egypt to Moses and Aaron, and thus attributing their problem to Moses and Aaron, is very telling for the mindset of the Israelites at this time. That, yes, they were willing to sing Mi Chamocha, who is like you, God, but they still associate their success and their difficulties with Moses and Aaron first and foremost. And God appears to be a bit of a distant third in their consideration of why is this happening. By giving Moses and Aaron credit for bringing them out, they are also then put in the mind to criticize them for not properly providing. When in fact we know, as Moses and Aaron point out, scroll back down to their response, right, that if you're going to complain, realize that you are complaining against Adonai, that you are complaining against God. Complaining against us is pointless, because who are we, right? Who are we? We are not the ones who took you out of Egypt. God is. We're not the ones who are going to feed you. God is. Does that make sense? All right. So with that in hand, let's go ahead and see the response. And as Aaron spoke to the whole Israelite community, they turned toward the wilderness, and there in a cloud appeared the presence of the Lord. Right, this idea of God's glory. The Lord spoke to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Speak to them and say, by evening you shall eat flesh, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord, the Lord, am your God. In the evening, quail appeared and covered the camp. In the morning, there was a fall of dew about the camp. When the fall of dew lifted, there over the surface of the wilderness lay fine and flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? Or literally, manhu, for they did not know what it was. It's like a way of saying, what is this? And of course, the word man becomes the word man, meaning manna. It's basically they were eating whatchamacallit when they pulled this stuff off the ground. And Moses said to them, that is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. Now, we're not going to get into the rest of the commandments regarding the man, because I want to focus more on this grumbling complaint issues and Moses and Aaron's awkward position between the people and God, or at least that's where the people seem to be putting them, and how all of this works, and the nature of their complaint. So before we jump into the commentary, any questions in general on what we've read from chapter 16? Or comments, of course.
Just to point out the constant repetition of the phrase, the children of Israel.
Yes. Yes. And that, especially because we know that in the sequel to this incident, which comes in the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, we get more attribution to the Erev Rav, the masses that had the mixed multitude, that's the usual English, that had come with the Israelites when they left Egypt. But here, all of the blame is being put firmly on the shoulders of the native-born, if you will, Israelites themselves. All right, so let's see what our commentators make of all of this. And we'll begin with Ramban, partly because he also summarizes Ibn Ezra. So I always like, let me see if I can get it just, there we go. I always like when one commentator lets me talk about two of them. And what are we that you murmur against us, right? This was the lament of Moses and Aaron when the people turned to them about the problem. Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra explained at his meeting, and what power to act is there in our hands? We have only carried out what we have been commanded. Right? So Ibn Ezra is saying that when they are protesting back at the complaints of the people, they are saying, look, we don't have any power, right? We are not all powerful and thus able to provide. Ramban, however, but this is not so, meaning that is an incorrect interpretation of what are we that you murmur against us. Rather, the sense of the verse here is similar to, taken from Psalms 8, what is man that you are mindful of him? Something, by the way, which we often will include in our Yizkor meditations when we are remembering the fragility of life. Eternal, what is man that you take knowledge of him? For how little is man to be accounted? Right? How can we even begin to imagine why God could take notice of us when we are so little? And this here is an expression of humility, right? Rather than making it an expression purely of we lack the power, Ramban is saying, no, this is more a statement about the humility of Moses and Aaron. And instead, you should read it as meaning, for what are we that you should attribute us with bringing you out from the land of Egypt? Behold, we are nothing, and our work is vanity, meaning our work has no substance to it. Again, quoting from Isaiah. And your murmurings are not against us, but against the Eternal. It is he who brought you out from the land of Egypt, not we. And in the Mechilta, we find, are we so distinguished that you arise and murmur against us? So Ramban, based off the Mechilta, is saying this is not just a question of we don't have the capacity to do anything, meaning that, you know, if they had the ability to provide food, they would, but we don't. Instead, their response is a deeper sense of human inadequacy, that they are trying to direct the people's complaint to God, not because they're afraid of shouldering the complaint, but because by putting them in touch with God as the complaint department, they're also making sure the people are aware that it is God that actually provides. Remember, the people are coming from Egypt, where they had their magicians that would do all sorts of things and take credit for it, where Pharaoh himself would take credit for the rise and fall of the Nile. And Moses and Aaron are trying to break that pattern. They are trying to make sure the people understand that their fate is in God's hands and not the hands of Moses or Aaron. So this is more than just a statement of limitation. This is a statement of recognizing the human condition in comparison to God. And Moses and Aaron are saying, look, you may think we're some like great, powerful people, but we're nothing compared to God, right? We may seem greater than you in your estimation because of what you have witnessed, but we are closer to you than any of us are to God. And you need to be focused on God, not on us. Questions or comments? Or we'll get to a deconstruction of the people's response, or rather the people's complaint. All right, so Rashi steps in for us, and actually, let me just see if I can get both. Yes. And in the morning you shall see, meaning the glory of the glory of God. Not in reference to that glory which is stated from verse 10, and behold, the glory of God appeared in clouds, as this said, but thus, in effect, did he say to them, right? Don't think of it as being when the cloud showed up, they all understood God's presence. There was something else that was the true kavod, glory of God in this time. In the evening you shall know that his hand has the power to give you your desire, and he will give you flesh, but not with a radiant countenance will he give it to you, because you have asked him something that is not proper and out of a full stomach. But the bread for which you have asked out of necessity, when it falls in the morning, you will behold the glory of the radiance of his countenance, because he will make it fall for you in a manner that is indicative of his love, as talked about in the Mechil to the Rabbi Yishmael. And in the morning, while there is yet time to prepare it, and there shall be dew above it and dew below it, as though it were carefully packed in a chest, taken from the Talmud in Masechet Yoma. All right, so let's break apart what Rashi is saying here a little bit. So Rashi is saying the glory of God is not a big fancy cloud. The glory of God is going to be how he responds to these two different requests, because really the request for the meat and the request for the bread were two different types of requests. The request for the meat was inappropriate. As such, it is not going to be responded to with a radiant countenance, meaning with God shining upon the people, but rather God will be responding with a harshness, because this was asked inappropriately. It was asked for out of a full stomach. And Siftei Chachamim at the bottom, as I've mentioned before, which are a super commentary on Rashi, try to answer what does that mean by it was improper. You asked it unnecessarily, because a person can survive without meat, right? You don't need to eat meat to live. Ask any vegetarian. Yes, it is slightly more complicated to produce the necessary nutrients without meat, but it is entirely possible, and certainly for a much longer period of time than you might imagine. And that means that asking for meat was really asking for something that was tasty. They weren't asking for something that was necessary. Furthermore, you made your request on a full stomach, right? The Siftei Chachamim pointing out that Rashi gives two explanations for why this was answered without the shining countenance. One, because they shouldn't have asked at all, because they could have done without meat. And two, because they had a lot of livestock. So as was already mentioned earlier on, if they really, really, really wanted meat, they had enough meat to eat. Yes, there might have been reasons why they didn't want to slaughter their own animals because of long-term economic stability. But if they're asking for something that they don't actually need, because you don't need meat to survive, then that means they should be prepared to put up their own expense for that. Meaning that God might be willing to provide, I'm sorry, I hope that leaf blower is not too loud. It's rather noisy to me, but hopefully the person will move past the window. That it's one thing to ask for something that you don't need. It's another thing to ask for something you don't need that you could provide for yourself if you were not being so selfish. So Rashi is really taking them to task based off the rabbinic commentary for not only asking for something that is unnecessary, but doing so because they don't want to lose what they already have that could provide for precisely the thing that they are asking for but don't really need. And then the second half, God is responding to the request for bread with a very understandable and appropriate response, meaning God is smiling upon them, if you will, with a shining countenance. When we talk about that in the Birkat HaKohanim, with the blessing of the high priest or the priests, where it says, may God shine his face upon you, that's what we're talking about. And that means in the morning, they got a very nice response because they had asked for something that was appropriate, meaning food. They weren't asking for anything fancy, just food. And that's what they got. And they got it in a way that makes it very beautiful, that the dew had come, and then the man, and then another layer of dew on top of it, so that it was fully protected, if you will, in a little packaging of dew. And this poetic expression lets us know that the request for bread was answered much more happily, if you will, than the request for meat. All right, questions or comments? Have I got that clear to everyone? Okay. Now, this idea of the man being so important, or indeed this entire section being so important, is reinforced in the recommended liturgy for a daily service. This is taken from Shulchan Aruch, and in the morning service, what we call Shacharit, Joseph Karo, the rabbi who wrote Shulchan Aruch, says, it is good to recite the passage of the binding, the Akedah, the passage of the manna, which is what we're reading right now, the Ten Commandments, and the passages of the burnt offering, the tribute offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and guilt offering, right? So the passage of the Akedah, because of the immense connection that we have to that act of Abraham nearly sacrificing Isaac. The Ten Commandments, you can imagine, also are incredibly important. The passages of the different sacrifices, because it is said that when we read about the sacrifices, it is as though we have done the sacrifices. So what are we learning then from the teaching about the man? What are we learning from daily reminder of this issue of manna? And I think what our ancestors meant by telling us to include this in our daily activity is that the passages regarding manna, when properly understood, has so many important insights into our own self and our relationship to God, that we will turn to God when we need something and not to a Moses or Aaron or anyone else, that we will also direct our request only to what we need and not merely what we want, and that we will recognize when those needs are being met or when we may need to add a little bit extra from ourselves. Right? Don't beg for something when you've already got it and just are selfishly holding on to it. Right? That this passages of our relationship to God, as spelled out in this passage of the man, is a very useful moral, ethical, and spiritual guide, and thus it fits in very nicely among all of these other monumental pieces of our text. Now, just one little aside. Which is from the Ramah. The Ramah is the European rabbi who wrote the first, not exactly commentary, but the parallel explanations of Jewish law for the European communities that were slightly different than the Sephardic communities from which Joseph Karo came from. He adds the following: but only in private is it permissible to recite the Ten Commandments each day. It is forbidden to recite them in the congregation. Now, why did they not recite the Ten Commandments in a public setting? I mean, what's wrong with the Ten Commandments? Well, for much of our history, there was a long-standing challenge to Judaism that only the Ten Commandments were still considered valid. Coming from the church, which surrounded Ramah in Europe, there was an idea that the entirety of the Old Testament, as they called it, had been negated, and only the Ten Commandments were still actually mandated, and everything else had been replaced by the Christian Bible. And as such, we were often hesitant to give the Ten Commandments too much public standing for fear that it would make others more convinced that indeed only the Ten Commandments had that standing. That if we read those 10 publicly, but not any of the other 603 publicly, that we would also be saying that the 10 were more important than the other 603. And as such, it became our custom to not make a big public deal on a daily basis about those 10 in order to allay those types of suspicions or accusations or supersessionist theological ideas. And that really continues to this day. You'll see that many Jews do not have the same fervent attachment to the Ten Commandments as some people do from other faith groups. That isn't to say we don't believe them. We've got them hanging up in our congregation. And of course, it's always important to remember that our counting of the 10 is slightly different in places than the counting of some other religious traditions. But that's a different discussion. All right, so we're not done yet, because we still need to understand this response from Moses and Aaron a little bit more deeply. Because as important as it was for them to redirect to God, there are other lessons that are found in this text as well. So first, let's use Sforno to understand that bridge. May it be God's will that you will see God's glory when he will set limits to various times of the day, so that you will know that your complaints addressed to Aaron and myself should really have been addressed to him, seeing it is he who will remove the cause of these complaints. So this is another way of saying that you're talking to the wrong people. You don't need to pray to us or appeal to us. You need to appeal to God. But he's arguing that the revelation of God's glory is not going to be the cloud or even the quail or the man, but the revelation of God's glory is going to be sunset and sunrise. That if you want to know what will provide for you, address that which creates the sunset and the sunrise, meaning talk to God. If you want to know where providence resides, it's not in our hands, it's in God's hands. And if you want proof of God's power, merely look at the rotation of the world and the rising and setting of the sun. And that should be proof enough that that is where you should be directing your appeal. Now, that again is I think a very powerful way of trying to direct the people towards God. But notice again that they are also directing the people away from them. And this has to do with our deep reluctance to elevate any human to a divine or even near divine status, or even as anything like a significant intermediary between us and God. And we see this echoed in the words of Rambam, Maimonides, in his Mishnah Torah, his law code, where he deals with the laws that surround the king for those times when Israel has had a king. So he writes as follows. In the same way that scripture has given him, meaning the king, great honor, and everyone is obliged to give him honor, as he talks about in previous sections, so has he been commanded to be of a subdued and unpretentious heart. As it says from Psalms, and my heart is empty within me, basically trying to remind us that the king is meant to be humble. He must not act overly haughty towards Israel. As it says from Deuteronomy, where the other laws of the king are enumerated explicitly, lest his heart become haughty over his brothers. He must be merciful and compassionate to the small and great with regard to their wants and welfares. And I apologize for the typo. He must show respect for even the lowest of the low. When he speaks to the entire congregation together, he is to speak sensitively. As David says, listen to me, my brothers and my people. And should you today be a servant to your people. The first one is from David. The second one from 1 Kings 12 is the advice that's being given to Rehoboam, who takes over after Solomon. An advice, I will point out, that he ignores and goes on to brag and boast and cause a civil war. But as Rambam is pointing out, a king, even though the king has so much honor due to him, even though the people are commanded to be obliging and show honor and respect to the king, needs to also dial himself down. It's easy to get full of yourself when everyone else has to praise, bow, and follow your every word. But that means you need to be even more careful to not become like that, because we can see from both Torah as well as these other examples from Tanakh that that is not the appropriate behavior for a proper king. And onwards, he must always behave with extreme modesty. For we have never had anyone greater than Moses, our teacher, who said, and what are we? Your complaint is not against us, right? Even Moses, which if we're doing a hierarchy, a pyramid of who is who among the Jewish people, even King David doesn't get to rank higher than Moses. And yet Moses, as we know from multiple parts in the Torah, was the most exceedingly humble person you would ever meet. And that was not just his personality, that was a requirement, meaning that only somebody like Moses could be Moses. Had Moses had all of his other skills and talents, but been arrogant, he could not have become Moses as we know. He would not have been fit for the revelation, let alone for leadership. And we see his humility here in this response to the complaint of the people, right? And we also see, as Rambam goes on, he, meaning the king, must suffer their burdens and criticisms and anger, as a nursing father carries the suckling child, taken from Numbers 11, where we see the sequel to the issue with the food. And Moses is feeling burdened, and in fact is complaining that he doesn't want to take care of the people anymore, like a nursing father that carries the suckling child. He is feeling overrun, and he wants help and assistance. And we can certainly understand his lament, but that is what a leader, a king, has to do. Scripture thus calls him, meaning the king, shepherd, to be a shepherd over Jacob, his people, from Psalm 78. And the behavior of a shepherd is as has been defined in the tradition, as it says from Isaiah 40, as a shepherd who leads his flock, and with his arm he gathers the lambs, and in his breast he carries. This is what a king, this is what a leader is meant to be. Not somebody who is just full of pomp and circumstance, not somebody who is just full of bluster, not somebody who just commands and demands, but somebody who, while still doing all the things that are necessary for the honor, dignity, and administration of the people, is exceedingly humble and exceedingly dismissive of any of the praise that might be directed at him, because ultimately, what is he that he is being addressed in this way? Questions or comments before we get to our next text? All right, so our next two texts both come from Beshallach Yesharim, and unfortunately it rolled over on the other page, I found out in the PDF. Beshallach Yesharim is one of the great books of what we call Musar, of special ethical instruction, not only for the high and mighty, but also for the rest of us as well. So he argues, they say in Chulin, in the Masechet, in the Talmud, it was not because you were greater than any people that the Lord desired in you and chose you. From Deuteronomy 7, God kind of pops our bubble by reminding us that God didn't pick the Jewish people to receive the Torah because we were the best people or the mightiest people. Instead, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Israel, my sons, I desire you because even when I bestow greatness upon you, you humble yourselves before me. How do we know that that happens? I bestowed greatness upon Abraham, yet he said to me, I am but dust and ashes. I bestowed greatness to Moses, and upon Moses and Aaron, yet they said, and we are nothing. And upon David, who also received the kingship, yet he said, but I am but a worm and no man. So we are reminded that all of the people who have received the greatest blessings throughout our tradition have also been the most humble and self-effacing people. And I don't think that is a coincidence. I don't think that that is a mere happenstance, that God just happened to give great blessings to people who happened to be exceedingly modest. I think that God is trying to remind us that it is this modesty, this self-deprecation that is what creates a proper fertile ground for the growth of a person and a growth of their spirit in the right direction. That arrogance, despite its popularity in the modern world, where being big, loud, and obnoxious gets a lot of attention, is in fact the opposite of what God wants and puts a barrier between us and God. And then he goes on on that later text to give us a bit of an analogy. To what is this similar? To a pig herder who rose to become the king. As long as he remembers his early days, it will be impossible for him to become arrogant. Likewise, when one considers that at the end of all his greatness, he will return to the earth to be food for maggots, all the more so will his pride be submitted and his growing arrogance quieted. For what is his good and his greatness if his end is shame and dishonor? Now, shame and dishonor here are not meant to mean dishonor in the more modern sense. It means that you'll end up a maggoty lump of rotten flesh. And that's not exactly something you should be proud of. It just is. Likewise, if a person remembers from where they came from, here arguing with the pig herder to become king, they can avoid arrogance because they'll recognize they don't deserve being king. It's not because they are so amazing that they are king. It is because they have this opportunity through whatever circumstance to fulfill this role. And if you recognize that it isn't your entitled position, but your responsible position, then that will help manage the arrogance. And likewise, if you imagine the other end of your life, for all of your greatness, for all of your power, for all of your honor and all of your glory as king or leader or whatever position you may occupy in life, at the end of the day, you will be a corpse. And so will everyone else. At the end of the day, everything that you think is so amazing and wonderful about you, that is part of the physical and temporary world, will be dust. In 50 years, in 100, and 200, and 1,000, there will be no trace of you left physically on the world. And if you can remember that and recognize that this is not a cause for despair, but merely a cause for perspective and merely a reason to be humble about what it is you are doing and who you are, then that will actually let you rise higher than any arrogance may entice you to rise. Because you will recognize your true potential is beyond the limits of this world. Your true potential is beyond what you can craft and grab with your own hands. But your true potential is by allowing yourself to have this humility so that you are open to the guidance that God is trying to give through the Torah and our tradition, so that your life will have greater meaning and greater purpose and greater satisfaction than anything that you might scrape or claw in a fight for more position or status. And Moses and Aaron exhibit this beautifully, as did David for most of his life, and as did Abraham as well. And those patterns are not just something for the king to be mindful of. All of us have the danger of pride and arrogance. All of us have the issue of thinking more of ourselves than we are, and usually thinking less of ourselves in the ways that should matter. And if we can continue to recalibrate that, if we can continue to remind ourselves daily through tefillot, through study, and through our actions, that yes, we are destined to be worm food, but yes, we can do better than just trying to avoid that end, then our life can have a much fuller experience during this time here. There is an old saying that a person should keep two pieces of paper in their pocket, one that says, I am dust or I am worm food, and the other that says, from my account was the world made. And that balance between thinking yourself worthless, don't. You should absolutely realize you have worth, but recognize that your worth doesn't lie in your body and in your physical accomplishments, that your worth lies in that part of you that is permanent, in your soul. Questions or comments?
A question and comment. I'm thinking about the earlier comment of the recommended daily service, along with the Mishnah Torah quote that you have. Mm-hmm. It ties in directly with the second half of Ashrei. Even though we may not read this section from Exodus, the second half of Ashrei does hit these themes of you provide food in its proper time. You open your hand with with what people need, not what they want, but what they need. And that God fulfills the desire of those who are faithful. He will rescue. But it ties in with my God and King, the whole relationship that the people are developing at this point with Adonai.
Right.
They never had, their only experience of a God and King is Pharaoh. So this is all very new. So, but that theme of Ashrei, it does remind us that this is why we sing that and we praise God, Adonai, in that beautiful psalm for these things that he does in this section of text.
Exactly right, which is why Ashrei is something that we say 3 times a day, because it is a very succinct summary, not only of God's glory and majesty, but specifically this idea of God is the ultimate source that provides for us. And like you say, this was intended as an antidote, an inoculation, if you will, against the contagion of the individual worship of Pharaoh as king that we had contracted while in Egypt. And very much the whole Exodus was a showdown between the arrogance of Pharaoh and Egypt as a whole and God. And the people are still learning. They are still looking to other people that they are considering the high and mighty or magic guys rather than towards God. And that's going to come back to bite us a little bit when we start building some golden animals. But it is an ongoing problem, shall we say, for the next 40 years, indeed a little bit longer than that. And it's something that we all can continue to work on now as well. Any additional questions or comments? All right. Well, we finished a little early today. That just means you have more time. If you haven't either read any of these passages today or done Ashrei, maybe just take a few extra minutes and give that a little bit of a meditation. But thank you all for joining me this afternoon. And I look forward to studying again, whether it be tonight for Mishnah, tomorrow for Pathways, or next Wednesday for our next Torah portion. Take care and be well, everyone.